Drawing with a pen can feel a little intimidating. With graphite, you can erase. With pastels, you can layer and blend. But with pen, every mark feels permanent. Once that line touches the paper, it's there. And that can make pen drawing feel stressful, especially if you're used to sketching lightly, blending values, or correcting as you go. But that permanence is also what makes pen drawing so powerful. Pen forces you to slow down. It makes you pay attention to line. It teaches you how to build value without blending. And it shows you how much you can communicate with simple marks. Comic book artists, graphic novel artists, illustrators, architects, designers, and sketchbook artists all use inked lines to describe entire worlds. A thick line can suggest shadow. A thin line can suggest distance. A cluster of tiny marks can create texture. And a simple change in direction can make a flat shape feel three-dimensional. Welcome back to Studio CC. In this episode of Art Media Basics, we're exploring pen drawing for beginners. We'll talk about what ink pens are, the difference between everyday pens and artist pens, the tools that make pen drawing easier, paper choices, line quality, and beginner-friendly techniques. Then I'll apply those techniques in a finished landscape drawing with mountains, trees, grassy hills, a small building, and a stream. So if pen drawing has ever felt scary because you can't erase every mark, this video is for you. Let's start with the tool itself. Ink pens are drawing and writing tools that use liquid, gel, or pigment-based ink to create marks on a surface. Some pens are designed mainly for writing. Others are designed for illustration, technical drawing, comic art, sketching, and fine line work. And while you can absolutely make art with a basic pen from an office supply store, artist pens are often designed with a few extra qualities in mind. They may come in multiple nib sizes. They may be waterproof once dry. They may be more light-fast, which means the ink is designed to resist fading over time. And they may give you more consistent line control. For today's video, I'll be showing both basic pens and artist-grade pens, because I don't want anyone to think you need expensive supplies to begin. You can start pen drawing with the ballpoint pen, or whatever you already have. But if you want something archival or waterproof, artist pens are best. Let's look at a few common types of pens you might use for drawing. Ballpoint pens are easy to find, inexpensive, and surprisingly versatile. If you press lightly, you can get pale, sketchy marks. If you press harder or build up layers, the value becomes darker. That makes ballpoint pens useful for gradual shading, cross-hatching, texture, and sketchbook studies. They're especially good for practicing control because you can slowly build value instead of jumping straight into a bold black line. The downside is that ballpoint ink can sometimes skip, smear, or create little ink blobs, depending on the pen and paper. But for beginners, ballpoint pens are a great reminder that you don't need fancy supplies to start drawing with ink. Another basic option is a felt pen, sometimes called a felt tip pen or marker pen. Felt pens usually create a darker, bolder line than a ballpoint or gel pen, and they can be useful when you want stronger outlines, graphic shapes, or areas of solid black. Because the tip is softer, the line may feel a little more expressive, especially if you change the angle or pressure as you draw. The downside is that felt pens can bleed through thinner paper, and they may not give you the same tiny detail as a fine liner. But for bold marks, quick sketches, silhouettes, shadows, and high contrast areas, a felt pen can be a really useful drawing tool. Next, standard gel pens. These are easy to find, affordable, and beginner-friendly. They usually come in sizes like 0.5, 0.7, or 1.0, and they can create smooth, dark lines. The downside is that some gel pens can smear, skip, or take longer to dry depending on the paper. But for sketchbook practice, warm-ups, and learning basic line techniques, they're completely fine. If all you have is a gel pen and printer paper, you can still start learning how pen drawing works. Technical pens were traditionally used for precise drafting, architecture, engineering, and design work. This set has a variety of ultra-fine nibs, which makes them excellent for precision work. Today, many artists use technical style pens or fine liners because they give consistent line widths. That consistency is helpful when you want a clean drawing. But it also means that if you want expressive thick and thin lines, you may need to switch pen sizes or use a brush pen. There are a wide variety of artist pens available on the market. Many sets come with a variety of fine liners and brush pens. Faber-Castell Pitt artist pens use pigment-based India ink and come in a variety of tip sizes and shapes. Fine liners are popular with artists because they can create clean, consistent lines. A smaller nib is useful for tiny details, textures, and light shading. A larger nib is useful for stronger outlines, foreground elements, or areas where you want more visual weight. Brush pens can create more expressive line variation because the line changes depending on pressure and angle. And if your ink is waterproof once dry, that opens the door for combining pen with watercolor, markers, or washes later on. For today though, we're keeping it simple and focusing on black and white pen drawing. A lot of artists like to layer other media on top of their pen drawings, like watercolor paint or alcohol markers. None of the basic pens I demonstrated are waterproof because all of them bled to various degrees. But all of the pens I demonstrated today held up against the alcohol markers, but I would experiment with your personal supplies prior to starting a drawing. Now let's talk about tools. Thankfully, you don't need a huge collection of supplies to start pen drawing, but a few tools can make the process easier. First, a 2H or an HB pencil. Even though this is a pen drawing video, I still recommend lightly sketching the main shapes first, especially if you're creating a more finished drawing. Because pen is permanent, a light pencil sketch can help you plan the composition before committing to ink. Second, a white vinyl eraser. Once the ink is fully dry, you can use this to gently erase the pencil sketch underneath. Just be careful not to erase too soon because ink that looks dry may still smear. Third, small rulers or stencils. You don't have to use these, but they can be helpful for borders, buildings, windows, frames, or straight architectural details. Fourth, a white gel pen. A white gel pen can help add small highlights, correct tiny areas, or bring back light details on top of black ink. It's not a magic undo button, but it can be helpful. And finally, scrap paper. This may sound basic, but scrap paper is extremely useful. You can test a pen before touching your drawing, check whether ink is flowing smoothly, practice a texture, or see if the ink is dry before erasing. Paper can change the way ink behaves. Some paper makes the pen glide smoothly. Some paper grabs the nib. And some paper causes feathering where the ink spreads into the fibers. Let's look at a few options. Marker paper is usually smooth and designed to handle marker ink with less bleeding. It can feel nice with fine liners because the pen glides across the surface. But very smooth paper may feel a little slippery, and some inks may take longer to dry. Bristol board is one of my favorite choices for clean pen drawings. It's thick, smooth, and sturdy. Smooth Bristol works well for crisp line work and detailed ink drawings. Hot press watercolor paper is smoother than cold press watercolor paper, but it is still designed to handle wet media. It has the most texture out of the three paper choices and will create the most wear on your pens. Before we get into specific techniques, we need to talk about line. Line is one of the most basic elements of art, and in pen drawing, line does a lot of the heavy lifting. With pencil, charcoal, or pastel, you can create smooth gradients. With pen, you usually build value through marks. That means your lines have to describe shape, texture, shadow, movement, and space. A line can be thin or thick, smooth or jagged, straight or curved, light or heavy, bold or expressive, and those choices affect the mood and structure of the drawing. Line quality refers to the character of the line. For example, if I draw an apple with one even outline, it may look flat. But if I make the shadow side thicker and the light side thinner, suddenly it has more depth. A thicker line can suggest shadow, weight, or closeness. This is why using different pen sizes can make your drawings look more dimensional. You're not just outlining, you're describing form. Now let's try out some basic pen drawing techniques. The first technique is hatching. Hatching uses parallel lines to create value. The closer the lines are, the darker the area appears. The farther apart the lines are, the lighter the area appears. In a landscape, I might use hatching to shade the side of a mountain, or create soft value across a hill. Directional lines are lines that follow the movement or direction of a form. If I'm drawing a grassy hill, my lines might follow the slope of the land. If I'm drawing water, my lines might move horizontally. If I'm drawing tree bark, my lines might move vertically. Directional lines help guide the viewer's eye and make the drawing feel more believable. They're especially useful in landscapes because almost every surface has direction, and your lines can show that. Contour lines describe the outer edge of a form. A contour line tells us where one shape ends and another begins. But in a pen drawing, contour lines do not all have to be the same thickness. You can make some edges thicker, some thinner, some broken, and some lighter. That creates more visual interest than one flat outline around everything. Cross-contour lines move across the surface of a form. Instead of just outlining the outside edge, they help describe the three-dimensional structure. Imagine lines wrapping around an object. On a round hill, the lines curve with the land. On a tree trunk, the lines might move around the bark. On a mountain, the lines might follow the ridges and plains. Cross-contour lines are one of the best ways to make a flat drawing feel dimensional without using smooth blending. Scumbling uses loose, scribbly, overlapping marks. In pen drawing, scumbling is great for organic textures. Bushes, tree clusters, grass, rocks, distant foliage. It creates value and texture without looking too controlled. The key is to vary the size and density of the marks. A few loose marks can suggest light texture. More layered marks can create a darker shadow area. Stippling uses dots to build value and texture. More dots close together create darker values. Fewer dots spread apart can create lighter values. Stippling can be beautiful, but it's also slow, so I like to use it selectively. It works well for rocks, sand, small foliage, texture on a path, or subtle value transitions. For this drawing, I'm using my Faber-Castell Pitt pens and Bristol paper. Before I start with the ink, I'm lightly sketching the major shapes in pencil. I'm not drawing every tiny detail in pencil, I'm just planning the overall structure, because with pen, planning matters. Once the main shapes are in place, I'll start in the background. I'm starting with the mountains because they sit farthest back in space. That helps push them back visually. I'll use contour lines to define the edges and directional hatching to show the slope of the land. On one side of the mountain, I'll add more hatching to suggest shadow. On the lighter side, I'll leave more white space. The paper itself becomes part of the drawing. For the pine trees, I'll use a combination of vertical trunk lines and quick scumbled marks for the branches. The branches do not need to be perfect. In fact, slightly irregular marks usually look more natural. For the sky, I'll keep the lines minimal. I'm just going to add a few light cloud shapes. If I add too much detail on the background, it can compete with the foreground. For the small building, I'll switch to a pen that gives me clean lines. A building gives the landscape a focal point and a sense of scale. Suddenly the mountains feel larger because we have something small to compare them to. Next, I'll move into the middle ground. This is where I can start increasing the detail a little bit. For the grassy hills, I'll use directional lines that follow the curve of the land. This helps the hills feel like they're rolling instead of flat. Here, I use a ruler for the roofline and the walls. Then I add texture with smaller marks, horizontal lines for the wood siding, and short hatching under the roof to suggest shadow. Now I'll move on to the foreground. The foreground usually gets the boldest marks and strongest contrast because it's the closest to the viewer. I switched to a bolder pen for this area. For the water, I use mostly flat horizontal lines. The lines can be broken and uneven because water reflects light in pieces. I'll leave white areas open to suggest highlights on the surface. For rocks, I'll use contour lines to define the shapes, then add hatching or stippling for shadow and texture. The lower edges can have heavier lines because that suggests contact with the ground and helps anchor the rocks in space. For grasses and foliage, I'll mix techniques. Directional lines for blades of grass, scumbling for bushes, stippling for small textures, and thicker lines in the darkest areas to create contrast. This is where the drawing starts to feel more complete. Looking back, I noticed that areas in the mountains look a little too dark for the background. I grabbed my white gel pen and strategically lightened some areas to push it further back. I also lightened some areas in the water that I felt got a little too dark. So that is a beginner-friendly introduction to pen drawing. We talked about why pen can feel intimidating, but also why it's such a powerful drawing medium. We looked at basic pens, gel pens, technical pens, and artist pens. We talked about helpful tools and compared paper choices like marker paper, Bristol board, and hot press watercolor paper. And we practiced techniques like cross contour, scumbling, and stippling. But the big idea is this: pen drawing is not about making perfect lines. It's about learning how to use lines intentionally. Your challenge this week is to try at least 3 pen drawing techniques. Maybe hatching, stippling, and cross contour. Or maybe try a small landscape drawing of your own. And let me know in the comments which technique felt the most natural and which one made you the most nervous. In the next episode of Art Media Basics, we'll be moving on to alcohol markers. So if you're interested in traditional art materials, drawing techniques, and practical art education content, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode of Studio CC.